Good morning, everyone. The presentation portion of our session today will be recorded for potential future use in the museum's virtual programs. If you do not wish to appear in the recording, we just ask that you please turn off your camera, and a reminder to please mute yourself unless you have a question to ask at the end or a comment to make. My name is Carla, and many of you will know me if you've joined us before for these coffee clubs. I work in the Western Development Museum in the Moose Jaw location. However, I've recently changed positions with the WDM, and while previously I was the Programs and Volunteer Coordinator at the Moose Jaw location, as of April 10th, I'm now the Programs Manager for the WDM organization. I'm still working out of the Moose Jaw location, but officially I now work for our corporate office in Saskatoon. A big welcome to everyone joining us from around the province today. My coworker Dave is joining us remotely from Saskatoon and will be helping to run the technical side of the presentation. He'll also be looking after the chat, and should you have any questions or would like to share a memory or a comment, you can note it in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll circle back around to those at the conclusion. And you're also welcome to just unmute yourself at that time too and ask your questions. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the WDM Moose Jaw is located on Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis. This is the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Dakota First Nations and the Métis people. The WDM is committed to working towards a new relationship anchored in the spirit of the treaties and to educating Saskatchewan people about their shared history of treaty making. The WDM has 4 locations, each with different artifacts and exhibits on display, as well as our corporate office in Saskatoon. And the corporate office sort of serves as a collections warehouse for artifacts that we don't have on display. Our Yorkton Museum tells the story of people through immigration and settlement in the last 100 years. The WDM North Battleford has an outdoor settler village and a working farm. The museum in Saskatoon is our largest and houses a 1910 boomtown right inside their building. Saskatoon also features exhibits on Indigenous history, including Métis cultural traditions and the signing of the treaties with the Crown. Moose Jaw's theme is the transportation history of our province. Now, we're quite fortunate today to be joined by our special guest, Dr. Elizabeth Scott, who will be presenting today's program, Our Collective Threads. Dr. Scott, who has many titles and credits to her honor here, is currently the Chief Curator and Director of Collections and Research at the Western Development Museum. She's also Adjunct Professor in the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan. Prior to joining the WDM in 2016, Dr. Scott held several postdoctorate fellowships and has worked as the Citizenship Officer for Saskatoon and Northern Saskatchewan with Citizenship and Immigration Canada as a citizenship case analyst in Ottawa, experiences that encouraged her to study the transnational history of immigration policies in Canada. Dr. Scott's collections, research, and exhibition work at the WDM focuses on Saskatchewan histories that explore the province's diversity, promote reconciliation and inclusivity, and showcase innovation. Dr. Scott is passionate about advancing reconciliation and building partnerships at the WDM, sharing the diverse history of the people of Saskatchewan and exploring our unique sense of place. She is honored to lead the stewardship of the WDM artifact collection for future generations to learn from and enjoy. Welcome, Dr. Elizabeth Scott.
I always really enjoy doing these coffee clubs, and I hope that today's presentation is both kind of interesting and informative, but also we're going to have some fun. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour, and what I'm going to do today is tell you some stories. We're going to explore our collection, some of our clothing artifacts and accessories. And so, yeah, I think just kind of get comfortable and get your coffees and teas and enjoy some of the stories that I'm going to tell you. So we'll just go to the next slide there, Dave. So our Collective Threads was a traveling exhibition that I curated to commemorate Canada's 150 in 2017. And it traveled to all 4 WDM locations. Some of you may have had a chance to see it in person. And what we've done is just recently expanded it and turned it into a virtual exhibit, which is available on WDM.ca. And I would love for everyone to check that out after the talk today and revisit some of the stories that we've gone over today. But then I'm not telling all the stories. I'm not giving everything away in the presentation. So there's lots still to explore on the website. And if you know any educators or we have any teachers with us today, there's also a school program that goes with this virtual exhibit, which is, I think it's curriculum connected for grade 5 to 8. So what this exhibit does is use high-resolution photography, and that has allowed us to share the WDM textile collections in a way that protects them from the kinds of damages that they might be subject to were we to put them on physical display. So clothing is very difficult to display in a museum setting. Anytime we handle a garment, it's subject to damage. Anytime you hang a garment on a mannequin with its delicate, perhaps beading or thread work, you're taking a little bit of a risk. And on a mannequin, the garment also has that kind of downward pull. And so between those things, UV rays, dust, pests, and other contaminants, garments are just notoriously difficult to put on exhibit. So what we like to do is find other ways that we can share their fascinating stories. And in the 21st century, we have the benefit of really great cameras. And we're also going to be playing around with some 3D photography this year, which is going to be really neat for our collections. So the clothes that we wear offer clothes to who we are and where we come from. What we wear can often tell others about our hobbies, our interests, our skills, our cultural backgrounds, our jobs. Some clothing is purely functional, and other garments represent everything from religious beliefs to gender norms to power, wealth, and influence. Some clothing is culturally significant, and some is just fun and fashionable. Other pieces are worn only in special ceremonies or to mark important life events. So we're going to look at several types of clothing today and the materials that they are made of. I'm going to tell you some ordinary stories alongside extraordinary ones. Stories that reflect our place-based identities, our prairie identities, and reveal what I would call, kind of calling them adjacent histories about life in the prairies. Little kind of glimpses that the clothing take us down these different pathways. So I hope that you can see something of yourselves or your family and friends in these clothes, and that you also might learn something new. The pieces chosen really reflect our province's great diversity, and I always like to remind folks that Saskatchewan has always been a diverse place, and it's embodied right there in our provincial motto, "From many people's strength." So let's get started. Right off the bat, we're going to start with a Saskatoon story. So Truman Frederick Calder, a wealthy Saskatoon financial broker, bought this ornate green satin and black silk gown on a trip to Paris, France in 1912 at the Bon Marché for his wife, Della. The delicate hand-stitched embroidery sets the gown apart as an exceptional example of French couture in Saskatchewan. Della's dress transports us back to Saskatoon's first boom time. The entrepreneurial city had not yet felt the hardships of war and economic uncertainty that would shape the next 3 decades. But for Della, her world would change suddenly when she was widowed in 1914, after Truman was devastatingly struck by lightning when his car stalled on a country road and he got out to turn the crank to start the engine again. In an instant, Della lost not just her husband, but her entire way of life embodied in this dress. With no will and few property rights for women, Della and her children were shockingly left penniless. She was forced to sell the house at 848 Saskatchewan Crescent East, one of Saskatoon's finest homes, to support herself and her 3 children. But she persevered and made a new life for herself and her children in Saskatoon, running a boarding house on Temperance Street. Her daughter no longer wore an ermine coat to school, driven by a footman in a coach, but instead worked in the boarding house with her mum. So here she is wearing the dress in 1914 before the tragedy of her husband's death that same summer. And it's quite a striking picture, really quite kind of a spectacular impression of wealth in that time. Just sort of as spectacular as the house itself. The dress itself was kept and passed on to her granddaughter and eventually accessioned into the WDM collection, a memory now of a former life lived. So next we have these wonderfully, now for something completely different, these wonderfully well-worn children's overalls from the North Battleford area. And just an aside, I wanted to pick a few garments from children. Maybe that's because I'm a mom, but I wanted to make sure that we had some little ones' clothing in the exhibit as well. So little is known about who wore these overalls, but the many patches on the knees and the back suggest they came from a family that experienced, like many, hard times and making do. The faded out signature GWG brand red stripe is reminiscent, I think, of a childhood spent in the hot prairie sun. Advertised to be, quote, just like his dad's, GWG's durable and affordable farm overalls for boys were a staple piece of clothing on Saskatchewan farms in the 1930s and wartime 1940s. For young immigrants new to Saskatchewan, owning a pair of these meant fitting in. Boys wore their overalls in all 4 seasons, over flannel shirts in the winter, with wool socks, and bare-chested in the summer. So these overalls got me thinking about what it was like to be a farm kid in the mid-1940s, torn between farm chores and responsibilities and school. Only about a quarter of students in Saskatchewan made it to grade 12 during this decade, so it wasn't easy to balance all of those demands. It would take until 1964 when mandatory attendance in Saskatchewan schools was raised to the age of 16. And this change meant that high school students who were expected to work on the family farm often found the extra demands of school difficult. So as another aside, one of the things I love about those overalls is, aesthetically, they're not quite as extravagant or what have you as the dress we just looked at. But it's a reminder that at the museum, it's the story that really matters, right? And so something might not be super pretty or beautiful to look at, but there's sort of its own beauties in the story. All right. So, Jennie Howe and her husband Wong Get Howe, who went by Charlie, established the Star Cafe in Marcelin in 1923. Jennie and Charlie immigrated to Canada from China as children. Charlie worked as a cabin boy to pay his passage to Canada when he was 12. Jennie was carried off the boat by her dad as a toddler, which she was said to have remarkably remembered. They met and married in Vancouver in 1918 and had 2 children, David and Pearl, before moving to Saskatchewan via a short stint in Alberta. Winding up in Marcelin, the couple and their small children integrated quickly into the community, building what would become an institution in the town, the Star Cafe. The son, David, who I'll tell you more about in a minute, said his parents embodied the same, quote, spirit of pioneers, his words, of the area's white settlers, a kind of testament to their hard work and community building. David believed this in large part because he couldn't understand why they would leave temperate Vancouver with a vibrant Chinese community to come to the frigid prairies and be culturally quite isolated. He remembered his mom hauling water in freezing conditions and working 16 to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. She could peel a bushel of potatoes in a day. Money was sent back to China, at least in the 1920s, as we found copies of checks that had been sent home when we acquired the many artifacts we did from the family. And this life of hard work really stood in stark contrast to the one Jennie expected. Coming from a prominent Chinese business family, Jennie expected a life of leisure, and I think we can see hints of that in this beautiful garment made of elegant silk and others that we have collected from her. Jennie kept this dress, Cheongsam dress, meaning long dress, and other Chinese garments her whole life, even though she normally wore Western-style clothing most of the time. Now, we can only speculate that the garments helped her stay connected to her Chinese culture while she integrated into Canadian society. In her cafe, Jennie learned to cook many different kinds of cuisine to suit her community. And while the family ate a Cantonese meal nightly, Jennie learned Russian, French, and English cooking, as well as the languages that informed the food. She served the public until an advanced age, and into her 80s, community members would visit her in her apartment above the cafe. Charlie had died much earlier in the 1940s, a young man at the time. Son David took a central role in the cafe after his father's death. As a young boy of 12, he wrote to the then future Prime Minister Diefenbaker in Prince Albert to help his family with a legal matter, which saved the cafe from bankruptcy in the very difficult 1930s. And he did this because he had to, as many first-generation children did, whose parents had limited English. As he grew up, David immersed himself in Marceline life, known as Mr. Hospitality. David operated the Star Cafe for 79 years. He even added a store to the cafe, selling televisions, radios, insurance, and golf clubs. When it closed in 2002, it was Marceline's longest-running business, having hosted decades of town life, including an annual Christmas Day opening where town residents would spend Réveillon, a Christmas tradition of staying up all night after midnight mass on Christmas Eve. David served as mayor for 3 years and later received the Saskatchewan Order of Merit, an accent tourism award, the Lieutenant Governor's Canada 125 medal, and in 2015 was named Marceline's Hometown Hero, sponsored by CTV. His name was even included on the Mars rover in 2003. As much as David and his mom, Jennie, and the whole family were embraced by the community, and indeed, I think, arguably celebrated, life wasn't without difficulty. David never married, for example, because he explained that there were no Chinese girls in town, and it would have been frowned upon, in his words, to have married a white girl. Go to the next one there. So here's Jennie and Charlie wearing Western-style clothing. To kind of close out their story, Jennie was a Saskatchewan woman, first and foremost. She was a beloved mother, community builder, and businesswoman. She raised children who embodied the best of citizenship. And so her dress, I think, reminds us of the complexities of migrating from one world to another in the early 20th century. It hints at the connections we keep while we build a new life for ourselves as immigrants. All right. So next up, we have a typical mid-20th century child's hockey sweater. For all the sports fans out there. So in 1894, hockey teams from Regina and Moose Jaw met in the first reported hockey competition in Saskatchewan. By 1900, there were competitive teams in Prince Albert, Moosomin, and Indian Head. The first junior teams were formed while older players were serving overseas in the First World War. Before minor hockey was organized in the 1950s, schools, churches, and community groups taught the game. This child's hockey sweater from Connaught School in North Battleford is a boy's size large. And the sweater reminds us of a time when little equipment was needed to play the game. Today, it costs upwards of $3,000 to register and equip a child for hockey. And those are my numbers from 2017, so it might even be more now. From the most legendary icons like Gordie Howe, Fred Sasakamoose, Brian Trottier, and Wendell Clark, to more recent stars like Hayley Wickenheiser, Brian Getzlaff, Braden Holtby, and the Shen brothers, Luke and Braden, successful Saskatchewan players learned to play the game through the province's high-quality youth hockey programs that grew out of these school programs. Sport has been central to coping with life in Saskatchewan, particularly in the winter, especially this past winter, which was very long. This one probably wasn't worn very long, or maybe it was worn by a kid who didn't love hockey, because it's in excellent condition compared to some of the other well-worn sweaters that we have in the collection. So a very sweet piece. Okay, so we're going to jump back into the 19th century. We're not going chronologically, but that's okay. We don't always have to do things chronologically. So in 2019, we had the great privilege here at the WDM of working in partnership with Spirit Wrestler Productions and the University of Saskatchewan on the Doukhobor Living Book Project, which was a soundscape installation and historical exhibit that ran that year at the WDM Saskatoon. Some of you may have seen that. We were fortunate enough to be awarded the Governor General's Award for Excellence in Museums for that project. Really, really big honor. And needless to say, I learned a lot about Doukhobor faith and culture that year. And so I'm very pleased to include this dress in my selection of garments today. Originally from Russia, Doukhobors, or spirit wrestlers, as they have sometimes been referred to, are Christians who believe in peace and equality because they believe that the Spirit of God lives in the soul of every person. They believe violence against a person attacks the Spirit of God in that person's soul. And they also believe there's no difference between princes, priests, and peasants. Everyone can follow Christ's example and be guided by the Spirit of God in their belief system. These beliefs led Doukhobors to challenge the authority of the Russian government and the Orthodox Church in the 1700s and 1800s. They suffered torture, imprisonment, dispossession, and exile as a result. Beginning in 1877, Russia required Doukhobor men to join the military. Russian authorities imprisoned and exiled those who refused. So to demonstrate their commitment to peace, thousands of Doukhobors threw their weapons and military registration papers into bonfires on June 29, 1895. Many participants in this burning of arms event were assaulted and forced to leave their homes and everything they owned. Suffering poverty and disease in exile, the Doukhobors sought refuge in another country, Canada. So the Doukhobors brought few possessions with them from Russia: clothing, bedding, cookware, and tools, and they depended on charitable donations and government funding to purchase food and supplies at first, but soon earned money as railway workers, farmhands, domestics, and needleworkers to become self-sufficient. By 1900, the Doukhobors had constructed over 55 villages on homestead land reserved for them on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, and had broken hundreds of acres of prairie land. Women did much of this labor, while Doukhobor men worked for wages away from the villages. This dress was worn by Onya Kabaroff for her Doukhobor wedding in Russia in the 1880s before coming to Canada. When her and her husband Fedor came to Canada in 1899, they brought this dress with them. The wool and linen pieces of this outfit were homespun in the Doukhobor tradition, while the cotton and other fabrics would have been purchased on an annual trip to a larger town. One of the traditions Doukhobor women brought with them to Canada was to grow flax for spinning and weaving to make fabric for their own linen garments, and this dress is no exception to that tradition. As time passed, Onya and many other Doukhobor women began to adopt the style of clothing worn by the other settlers around them. They wore traditional outfits like this on Sundays and special occasions, and passed these garments on to their children. This dress had the good fortune of staying in a family that worked hard to preserve its Doukhobor traditions. Onya's granddaughter was award-winning painter Agatha Stupnikoff, who captured Doukhobor life on canvas. So a beautiful piece. The colors on this one are so vibrant, and we featured it in the Doukhobor Living Book Project exhibit for a short time. It was decided that there was a short enough run that we're going to take the risk to displaying it, but it's now safely back in storage. But we can enjoy it here with this beautiful photography. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead to the next one there. All right. So potash is the name for several forms of common salt used as crop fertilizer. This is probably no surprise to anybody. But Saskatchewan has the largest and richest potash deposits in the world. For at least another century, the province is poised to be a world leader in potash production, although the global market, of course, dictates the actual rates of mining and trade at any given time. In 1997, potash was named the official mineral emblem of Saskatchewan, and this is a fitting choice for a province that prides itself on agricultural leadership and excellence. Sometimes called the quality nutrient, potash is used all over the world as a crop fertilizer for corn, soybeans, coffee, rice, and potatoes. And I think we can all agree that aside from agriculture, we're quite well known for our potash, and that potash mining has shaped tens of thousands of people's lives in this province for decades. So how do we gear up for potash work? Well, these coveralls were worn by Devin Lorenz, who was working then at that time at PotashCorp's Allen mine. Devin is one of over 30,000 Saskatchewan people employed in the mining industry. His coveralls remind us of workers who spend their days 1,000 meters underground. They work in tunnels of potash deposited about 400 million years ago. So when we think about the long days spent wearing these types of garments, we can remember the ways in which the land and its deposits interact with the bodies that work on them. Some people might discard these kinds of well-worn garments, but they do have an inherent museum value. Again, not because they're aesthetically pleasing, but they tell us a story about who we are and who we have been. Oh, skipping ahead a little teaser there. Okay. So this is a story that, funnily enough, starts in Ireland. William McGrath and his brother James McGrath emigrated from Ireland to Ontario in 1874. Interestingly, this is the same year Treaty 4 is signed, where they eventually end up settling. 10 years later, they headed west to settle on a farm in the Crescent Lake region near Yorkton. As part of Yorkton's steady growth, the McGrath brothers opened a general store there specializing in the fur trade. Now, McGrath family history tells of a close friendship between William, James, and Chief Kinistino of the then Littlebone First Nation in the area. Chief Kinistino likely met the McGraths at their store, but they may have met earlier in the Crescent Lake area. We just don't know. Chief Kinistino and James were reportedly such good friends that Kinistino served as pallbearer in James's funeral, and he was remembered as a, quote, true friend, in the words of the family of the McGraths. Chief Kinistino would sometimes offer gifts to the McGrath family in exchange for provisions. These moccasins form part of a collection of beaded handicrafts from him and his family. The moccasins symbolize now the bonds of friendship between early settlers and Indigenous peoples at a time of momentous change. The McGrath-Kinistino friendship, we'll just go to the next one there. The McGrath-Kinistino friendship reminds us that in those couple of decades after treaty, settlers and Indigenous people relied on a framework of mutual exchange and benefit, particularly in the context of the fur trade, in ways that shift through the end of the century into the 20th century. And these moccasins remind us of that kind of delicate time. Retrieving them from storage presented an opportunity for me as a curator to think about that immediate post-treaty period and the connections between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples as the area began to change quite drastically demographically. The McGrath family kept these for over 100 years, and I think this tells us something as well about what this friendship meant to this family. Okay. So this is a fun piece. This is one of the pieces we've collected more recently in another Saskatoon story for you here. So square dancing in Saskatchewan has bridged cultures and identities for decades. Wilma Jess and her husband Bernard loved to square dance and twirl around the dance floor together. Wilma loved country music and farm life. She grew prize-winning vegetables and flowers in the Outlook area where she and Bernard retired. Wilma bought this vibrant red dress with silver trim at Vern Welker men's wear store on 2nd Avenue in Saskatoon. In business from 1948 to 1970, Vern and Clara Welker carried a line of square dancing clothing for men and women and were avid square dancers themselves. Wilma wore her Welker's dress to many barn and hall dances in Saskatchewan. Square dancing continues to be a vibrant part of Saskatchewan life with dances, lessons, and competitions across the province. Quite a delightful piece. Okay. So this is a Keptar, or short sheepskin vest or coat, generally associated with Ukraine. And it dates to the first decade of the 20th century, and it belonged to the Wlasichuk family, who came to Canada in 2 waves. I'm going to quite quickly go on to the next one there. So this Keptar, which we can see in the photo on the gentleman who's on the far left there, was worn by Parton, who was also known as Kartam Wlasichuk, and was later passed down to his son George. The Wlasichuks lived in the Bukovina region, of what is present-day Ukraine. In 1913 or 14, Parton, Zanahiria, who went by Rosie, and their youngest sons, Vasil, who went by Bill, George, and Steve, came to Canada. George was approximately 11 years old at the time. Parton and Rosie's 2 eldest sons, Metro and John, who can be seen in the back of the photo there, had left for Winnipeg in 1909. And we think we can date this photo to that year, as Steve is a baby. So if we do the math, the family wasn't exactly sure, but we're pretty sure that it is 1909. I believe this portrait was taken to mark the occasion of the older boys leaving for Canada. The family is wearing their best clothing, they are adorned with beads, and certainly there is an air of formality here with the Keptar vests. Men specialized in making and decorating Keptar, doing their own embroidery, trims, and leather work. Now, the Canadian census shows that by 1921, the whole family had reunited and settled together near Verrigan in the RM of Sliding Hills. Little George grew up to work for CP Rail and farmed. He loved carpentry and playing cards, and most of all, he loved his grandchildren. George lived to 94 years old and passed the 2 Keptar vests in the collection down to his children. Like many of the ethnic clothing we've talked about already today, this vest is inextricably bound up in the family's story of migration and holds in its fibers the spectrum of human emotions that emerge when we leave home and make another one somewhere else. To wear these garments for this momentous occasion of sending your teenage sons off to Canada without you is, as a parent, of course, one of those defining and difficult moments, surely. Okay, so next I'm going to tell you about Dr. William Percy Johns, who was one of Saskatchewan's early rural doctors. Today, we often take the availability of medical care somewhat for granted. Perhaps, of course, this sense of surety has been rocked a little bit lately by the pandemic. But when Saskatchewan became a province in 1905, doctors, drugstores, and hospitals were few and far between. Rural doctors made hundreds of house calls a year to patients spread out across great distances. These services were too expensive for many rural people. As a result, the Saskatchewan government developed programs and policies that would eventually lead to Medicare in the 1960s. In 1912, Dr. Johns started his practice in Viscount, and his territory ranged east to Guernsey, west to Clonsey, north to Bruno, and south to Manitou Beach. He would remain the area's doctor until an incredible 1959, providing a lifetime of service to the area. Now, to cover these long distances in winter, Dr. Johns traveled by open cutter, but later in a converted Model T snowmobile. To keep warm, he bundled up in this heavy wool coat that we've just looked at, lined with beaver fur. We can only imagine that the warmth of his patients' homes must have been a welcome relief. Dr. Johns' early snowmobiles, he had 2, weren't always easy to run. On one of his last runs, he ran out of oil and stopped at a farmer's yard. The farmer didn't have any oil, and so they decided to put water in it to at least try to keep the machine going. Now, this was an important run because he had to deliver a baby in the Plunkett area. He made it on time and indeed brought that little baby into the world, but in the process, his snowmobile suffered irreparable damage. And from then on, Dr. Johns wore this coat and traveled in a heated horse-drawn caboose. So this coat and other coats like it that we have in the collection are incredibly heavy. So warm, yes, but cumbersome. I often think about Dr. John's and what this life of his was like. Covering these really long distances to get to patients certainly required these kinds of garments, but it couldn't have been comfortable at all. And I think about how he must have just been very tired. So I really admire him and country doctors like him. Okay, so the artifacts we've considered so far cover a range in the times they were donated from the earliest days of the museum to more recently. These next 4 selections represent the kinds of artifacts we've been collecting lately. So here's one example that we included in the physical version of our collective threads in 2017. This is a t-shirt from the Saskatoon Indigenous fashion company SheNative. Founded by Devin Fiddler in Saskatoon in 2014, SheNative is a high-end fashion brand designed to empower Indigenous women and girls. This t-shirt features the #warrior graphic from her first apparel collection. Today, the brand has grown to include beautiful leather work and continues its mission to elevate Indigenous women and girls and honor missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The t-shirt represents part of a recent resurgence of Indigenous contemporary fashion design. So this artifact is also a reminder that the WDM doesn't only collect old things. We are interested in artifacts that were made as recently as yesterday, if there is a significant Saskatchewan story to be told. So I wanted to point out as well that the WDM has, since its inception, collected Indigenous artifacts, and we do that today in partnership with Indigenous families and organizations. We've recently committed to answering 8 of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and part of that work involves repatriation of sacred artifacts we had in the collection, but it's also about forming new and renewing old relationships with First Nations who may or may not have been involved with the museum before. So this is an example of an acquisition of a jingle dress and complementary beadwork that was accessioned in an ethical manner in partnership with the family at the time. This is a child's jingle dress that belonged to Kobe Goforth, whose mom made it for her. Kobe danced in this outfit at her first powwow in Mission, BC around 1999. She continued to dance in the outfit over the summer at a number of powwows. And as kids tend to do, she grew, and by the end of the summer, she had outgrown her beautiful jingle dress. So although this outfit was sewn together in only 3 days, the beadwork took close to a month to complete. Kobe's mom, Robin, was taught by her grandmother to bead, around 14 years old, and Robin has passed that on to her children. She started with floral patterns because that's what her grandma used to bead. She also enjoys eagle and horse designs, as well as some more contemporary patterns like hummingbirds and butterflies that we see on this set. The jingle dress is a sacred and highly respected garment, and the WDM is honored to care for this one. Okay, this is one of 2 acquisitions we did a couple of years ago that really embrace our current vision at the WDM of a Saskatchewan where everyone belongs and histories matter. And it's artifacts like these beautiful garments that start to make that vision a reality. In our legislation, we're mandated to care for, preserve, conserve, and share the cultural and economic history of Saskatchewan. It's a very broad mandate, so we keep working at including more stories to be more representative of that total history. These men's and women's formal outfits belong to Dr. Parm Lally and Dr. Anita Chakravarty of Saskatoon. Dr. Lally purchased these in New Delhi in the 1990s. They were worn for several formal events in Saskatoon. At the time of purchase, Dr. Lally and Dr. Chakravarty looked for more muted colors and less elaborate decoration than is typical of Indian formal wear in an effort to match the formal wear in North America, which is a very interesting part of this story. Dr. Anita was the son of Dr. Aninda Chakravarty, a professor of geography at the University of Saskatchewan, first hired in the 1960s. The Chakravartys were one of the first Indian families to live in Saskatoon. Anita remembers as a child that people here knew very little about Indian people and culture, and it was hard to find the proper spices for cooking, musical instruments, clothing. These items were often purchased in India then and shipped back to Saskatoon. These obstacles, however, were overcome, and the family fiercely identified with being Canadian more than any other identity. They are proud to be on their 3rd generation of U of S alumni with graduates in medicine, law, and dentistry. These garments add to our collection of textiles, being more representative of Saskatchewan people who started to come from non-European nations in larger numbers in the mid-20th century. Okay, so the last set of garments that I would like to talk about today belonged to Betty Chan of Saskatoon. Betty Chan was a Canadian Championship Highland dancer in the 1950s and 1960s. As a young child, Betty began her dance career in tap and soft shoe styles, but became increasingly fascinated with Highland dance. As there's no prerequisite to be of Scottish ancestry, Betty was welcomed into the Highland dance world across North America. It would come as no surprise that there is no Scottish clan named Chan, and there was, as such, no Chan tartan that Betty could wear for competition. And so to honor her, From Brothers of Galt, Ontario, kilt makers, designed and wove what is known as the Chan plaid, or sometimes the McChan tartan. Her plaid was designed to reflect her Chinese heritage with the colors of blue, green, and yellow, which all had significance in Chinese culture. Betty not only excelled in her Highland dancing, winning multiple trophies and garnering considerable media attention, and even the attention of Prime Minister Diefenbaker, who asked to meet her, but she retained this passion her whole life, teaching the dance and judging competitions. Her dancing costume and her story is yet another example of the complexity of our identities and teaches us about how newcomers to Saskatchewan carved out a place for themselves, how they expressed their own identities and adopted new ones, how cultural boundaries can be fluid, how we can learn from each other and share our unique traditions with one another. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. And I hope you enjoyed it. Taken together, I think these garments present a really interesting way of thinking about Saskatchewan history. Individually, of course, they're all wonderful stories, but I look forward to the discussion and thank you for listening.
So thank you very much for that presentation, Liz. That was terrific, and we'll chat a bit more about it in a moment. But just while we have the slide up here, next month, Tuesday, May 30th at 10 a.m., we'll be exploring the theme Homemade Saskatchewan with our special guest, WDM content specialist, Karine Dalick. From building a mechanical horse to making clothes from building a mechanical horse to making clothes from cloth flour sacks, that's a bit of a tongue twister, Saskatchewan people have always been a resourceful and creative bunch. Learn about a few of the homemade treasures that are a part of the WDM's artifact collection, as well as hearing the fascinating stories of their creators. So again, we hope that you enjoyed our presentation today and that you'll be encouraged to share this with your friends and family. We're always looking for new coffee club members. And the other thing I can kind of mention here quickly is that we're quite happy to let you all know, if you've not been on our YouTube channel lately, our library now has a number of the past virtual coffee club presentations available to view. These include the Spirit and Intent of Treaties 1 through 7, Winter Travel, Railway Porters in Saskatchewan, Holiday Traditions, and Violets, Saskatchewan. One other note to kind of make mention of here is you can always fill out our feedback survey. This is something that would have been in the email you got with your confirmation. And we can always put it in the chat here in a moment as well. We always like to hear your suggestions and get your feedback so we can continue to improve this program going forward. Thanks again to everybody for joining us. Do look forward to next month, the end of May, and we'll be talking about Homemade Saskatchewan, and we hope to see you all then. So thank you very much.